Welcome back to Read 536, Week 7. This is part 3 of our discussion on policy and politics and reading instruction. So let's talk for a second about the influence of Becoming a Nation readers on curriculum and instruction. So there was already this grass movements amongst teachers that was embracing this movement towards a whole language approach, particularly as a backlash to the really strict systematic phonics instruction that was happening in the late 60s and the 70s, and kind of detaching phonics and decoding from making meaning. So there was a shift towards this idea of using real literature, getting away from basal readers, and really viewing reading a little bit differently. So, Becoming a Nation readers then supported or reinforced this view. And so, the next decade of reading instruction was really influenced by this lean towards whole language. Like I said previously, you can guess that there was really great criticism of Becoming a Nation of Readers. And I'm sure you could guess that it was especially around the phonics portion of it and it's the way that it addressed emergent literacy. Um, it actually prompted a follow up by the members of the commission who wrote it, who felt that they needed to defend and explain or justify their work. And one of the things that they often described was this tension between members on the panel. And they said that they would want to include something that they felt was important, but they would find that either the research available to them was thin or inconclusive, and that in some areas there was really no clear cut answer, as you know the research was in conflict on certain ideas or issues, phonics and emergent literacy being one of them at the time. But in any case, Becoming a Nation readers was very influential. In fact, it was often dubbed the Surgeon General's report on reading. So it certainly didn't put an end to the discussion on how best to teach reading, and if anything, it really heated the debate. One, I think, small example I can give you of its influence would be this example. So, based on the findings or the report, Becoming a Nation of Readers, several state boards, went as far as to define reading in their state education charters or to change the definition of reading. And so this is an example that was written by the Michigan State Board of Education. And they defined reading as the process of constructing meaning through dynamic interaction among reader, the text, and the context of the reading situation. So if you know anything about whole language or the field of psycholinguistics, that is a wholehearted endorsement of whole language. So this really is a big shift, and it really does bring about this debate. So really, whole language instruction begins to take hold here at the local level. Some states, like I said, they define reading. They even go as far as banning basal textbooks and workbooks and phonics series. Um, and this is it was always under debate, kind of the best way to approach reading, particularly in terms of phonic instruction, but it really is exacerbated during this time, right? So my little graphic of the reading wars, um, the light side, the dark side, depending on where you stand, right? Either of those sides could be whole language or explicit systematic instruction and phonics. Um, but the debate really starts to rage here. So this is the beginning of the reading wars. So by the mid 1990s, then we've got this debate between whole language and the phonics camp, and really the debate is raging mostly in the reading world because many schools are actually implementing a whole language approach um, on the local level, and so George Bush comes into office and he starts the push for national testing, but really his administration doesn't have any kind of standout policy or legislation. Their signature piece of legislation is the National Education Goals, which they write, but they don't really do much with them. And so, uh, Bush is only in office for 4 years, so usher in the Clinton administration, and what they do is a little more significant. So one of the things that George Bush did start was kind of this conversation about the idea of a national test, but it didn't really go anywhere. And so Clinton really picks up on that. The NAEP is already exists, but the way they use it is not the way that we use it today. And so the Clinton administration really starts to push for this idea of a national test in grades 4 through 8 to measure and monitor progress. Remember, the standards-based movement is in its initial phases now, so states are starting to come up with their standards, and so there's this idea that there needs to maybe be some way of norming or benchmarking standards as they create them. So they want to give this test for reading and for math. we've oh sorry we've got the reading wars in full swing by the mid 1990s, and we'll spend some time next week talking about the California example, because you read that over and over again. The California example, the California example. To some extent, they talk about what happens in Michigan, but really it's California. I'm going to spend the entire week on that next week. But then 1994, we have Goals 2000. So this is the codification of the national education goals put forth by the Bush administration. And it begins the standards movement. It is the push towards standards-based reform. Um, the it's written in 1994 to set goals for standards-based education reform. So many of these goals are based on this idea of outcomes-based education. So if you think back to a couple of weeks ago and our discussion on the theoretical perspectives, we're really talking about systemic reform, right? So this outcomes-based, systemic approach. Um, Many people would agree that Goals 2000 is the predecessor to No Child Left Behind. And what they wanted to do was, establish this framework that included world-class academic standards, as they said. Does this sound familiar, right? The beginnings of Common Core state standards. They wanted to have ways that they could measure student progress, and they wanted to provide support to students to help meet these standards. One of the interesting things, or one of the interesting aims of Goals 2000, in my opinion, was its interest in helping ensure that resources, measures of flexibility and authority were available to the LEAs, to the local education agencies, that would bring about the reforms that they were looking for. So they wanted to make sure that this flexibility and that all of these resources were really pushed down to the local level, so that the teachers and the school personnel, the principals, the parents, they would have the primary voice in figuring out how to achieve high quality teaching and get the learning outcomes that they wanted. They really had this focus on kind of pushing it away a little bit from federal control and making sure the stuff was available at the local level, rather than just imposing this mandate. Of course, it's still a federal mandate, right? So it's not totally free of federal regulation, but it did have this aim to start to push some of that stuff back down to the local level. And one of the ways that they kind of saw that they could do this, or that they intended to do this, was to allow the states and the local education agencies to coordinate their programming efforts, and to help, and that the federal government would help streamline all the federal goals. So let's say Title I would not compete with the goals that they set out by Goals 2000, and that these would not compete with local initiatives. So they really wanted everything to kind of funnel into one more streamlined goal. And they felt that one of the ways that they could do this was to have states enact standards, right? So the idea here is that if you had standards based education and if everyone, all student populations were working towards meeting those standards, you could align the goals of all programs because all programs would be working to help students achieve to meet those standards. So the idea that there were not going to be two sets of expectations for students, right? Everyone was going to be expected to work towards the same standards. Disadvantaged students, at risk populations, special education students, English learners, the gifted, everybody. So this would be because kind of what we had before was you had Title I and you had all those programs and you had special ed and they had their own concerns and programs and needs. And then you would have these more general initiatives like the national education outcomes and goals 2000. And so sometimes you would find not just those programs in conflict, but the funding streams in conflict. And so where was the flexibility um, for the local agencies to really work with what their needs were? So that was one of the aims of Goals 2000, and kind of the underpinnings of why they said they felt standards were so important. So we can be the judge, or you can be the judge of how well that actually played out, and if that actually was the intention of standards-based reform. But in any case, like I said in the previous slide, you've got the reading wars going on, these goals 2000, the beginning of standards. And then, as we're going to talk about next week, you've got this, what we call the California example. And so I'll just give you a little tease if you're not familiar with it. But in 1995, the California reading wars really come to a head. And we have some very dramatic policy shifts in California. And, as the saying goes, as California goes, so does so does the rest of the nation. So by 1997, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development forms the National Reading Panel. And the idea here is that once and for all, we're going to answer the question of what is the best way to teach reading and make our recommendations. It's significant that the panel is formed by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, because what it does is that it reinforces the idea that reading is a science and that their findings and this report and instruction must be research based, because this is an office whose foundations are in research. So they want to put an end into a debate. In the meantime, while the National Reading Panel works on this project for many years, they don't publish their report until 2000. So they work on it for a couple of years. But we've got the passage of the Clinton administration passes the Reading Excellence Act. So I am going to end our discussion right here, and pick up on part 4 of our discussion.